Just last week, an infant died at an Airbnb property in Florida. I could only imagine how devastating that was for the family. And honestly, this isn't even the only Airbnb horror story lately. There's a conversation that needs to be had. There's a reality that needs to be had. Whether you're a traveler or you're a host trying to wrap your head around what this might mean for Airbnb as a whole, let me give you some other experiences that I've personally had and other stories that I can tell you about some very bad things that have happened at Airbnb properties or from Airbnb guests. We're talking things like murder, people dying of strange medical conditions, people stealing entire apartments with the furniture. There's a lot that has happened inside of Airbnbs. This is not a new thing. This is a tragic first story that we're going to talk about, but it's just one of many. My name is Sean Rocky Geach. I've been hosting for 8 years. I've seen a lot, and it never gets easier. Let's go. Welcome back, YouTube world. So the facts of this one. This house in Wellington, Florida, which is near West Palm Beach, was involved in an unauthorized party previously before this French family came to stay. The police were even called. There's cocaine found at the property. Airbnb got involved. It was a whole thing. Now, this French family had an infant in the home. They put the baby down to sleep, and when they tried to wake that child up later, the child had already passed. This family is suing Airbnb over the death of their 19-month-old girl, and of course it leaves many questions. How could this have been avoided? Is it even avoidable at scale? Whose fault is it? And these questions bring to the surface very real dangers of the Airbnb space, this deregulated home sharing space. Homes are particularly at risk for something like this, but let me first say before I explain why, hotels have people dying in them all the time too. Not necessarily accidental children deaths, but a friend of mine has Airbnbs in places like Tulum, and in Tulum, both hotels and Airbnbs have to deal with drug overdoses and deaths from drug overdoses all of the time. I've personally had people die in my Airbnb properties. We'll get to that too. In this case, an accidental death of a child because there's traces of a drug on the floor or on some surface. It's a whole different story. Hotels are easier to clean because they're much more simple. They've been designed to be cleaned. Your home that you put on Airbnb, it's designed to be awesome and cool and fun and to make memories, but it was never designed with a cleaning process in mind, with hiring employees, vacuum, sweep, do whatever. All of the things and the knickknacks around the home, there's a lot to touch. There's a lot to work through with houses. And this explains the obvious room for oversight here. How can any one housekeeping company, no matter how much you pay them, how much time they realistically take between cleanings, at scale, when you get so used to cleaning one property, you become efficient, and with that efficiency comes things like cutting corners. And you very realistically could fail to properly vacuum up a hefty amount of cocaine that's spilled on a carpet. As an experiment, you put flour or chalk into a carpet, rub it in, and then try to use a vacuum to remove all of those particulates. If you didn't know it was something like cocaine, you might not be so vigilant to try to remove it perfectly, and you might go, oh, that's good. And this is very clearly where a host could get in trouble for negligence, unintentionally so, because everybody thought that they were doing their jobs. Now, this is assuming that the property was a good property and the cleaners were good cleaners, and that mistakes can still happen at scale for something like this. And with how powerful fentanyl is, it only takes very little to do a lot of damage. The history of fentanyl use is it is an opiate that is 50 times stronger than heroin. What happens in the drug industry is when somebody gets some product in, some drugs, and they want to make more money on the drugs that they have, they'll dilute it. Very much like the juice industry, not entirely from concentrate, only 10% juice. So in this case, they turned to something like fentanyl because it is so powerful that you can take such a small amount of it and you can mix it in with cocaine, and you can make a drug feel like it's got a big kick for the fact that now the drug is maybe 50, 60% cocaine, 30% filler of some sort, and then some fentanyl in there just to give it a little extra boost. We've all seen Johnny Depp in Blow. We know how this works. And that's why we have so many fentanyl overdoses now, is that the drug is so strong that if you did a sizable amount of any drug that was laced with fentanyl, you could take way too much of that one thing. It's really hard to be safe because you don't know what's in the drugs you're taking. And for the record, no, I've actually never done cocaine a day in my life, but I don't intend to, especially now that there's fentanyl in it. Much like the movie SLC Punk, Heroin Bob never did heroin a day of his life. The first time he ever took a pill from a stranger, somebody told him it was an Advil, and it wasn't, and then he overdosed at the end of that movie. That was really sad. Heroin Bob was a good guy. This is not isolated, but you need to understand that there is a exposure to risk that inherently exists in any industry. And it's no secret that hotels have deaths all the time. And that's not meant to be a defense for Airbnb. I'm not trying to say, hey guys, hotels are bad too. stay in Airbnbs and don't worry about the deregulation, because the deregulation is a big risk. Hotels have standards to keep. They actually W-2 employ all their own housekeepers, and those are all internalized. All of the responsibility is in one box. There's not this confusion of who's in control or who's at fault with a hotel, like with an Airbnb, where with an Airbnb, you could have a contractor for your cleaning, you could have a software for some automations over here, another software over there, you've got a co-host over here who's your expert, and then you're the investor. See, there can be a lot of hands in that cookie jar with an Airbnb property, but with a hotel, it's all entirely in-house systems, employees, and then there are organizations that are making sure that these hotels do exactly what they're supposed to do, like OSHA, for example. That leads to a forcing of quality that a deregulated industry can't really ever force when you're talking about people with their own houses. Airbnb is trying to provide more services to hosts, and that includes finding access to good cleaners that they will endorse, but this specific event of a child dying due to fentanyl may make Airbnb think twice about providing their own cleaners in situations that no one can be in control of. Because let's imagine now that Airbnb's cleaners, depending on how much they endorse these cleaners, were the ones responsible for cleaning that property, and then it wasn't cleaned well, and then somebody died. That could be more shared responsibility on Airbnb. See, Airbnb is being sued right now because the home was marketed as a place where there are no parties. It was marketed as a safe place, and Airbnb misrepresented that home because there was a previous party that was attempted to be stopped, but there was still the risk exposure from the attempted party there, and Airbnb did not disclose to anyone, hey, there was a party with drugs here just a few days ago. Airbnb wants to be removed as much as possible from these liabilities because honestly, getting sued for millions of dollars is just bad for business and bad for shareholders. That may be why Airbnb stock gapped down in pre-market on March 15th, going from $117 to $114 and change, probably on this news. One of my Airbnb guests was in a gang in Philadelphia, and they murdered 2 people. This made for a very heavy and sad 6 months of my life, and we eventually have pulled out of Philadelphia entirely, mostly for the reasons of break-ins and crime and gang activity. This group had booked multiple Airbnbs throughout the city in the spring of 2022, March, April, May. Then they started coming back and breaking into properties. We had 8 separate properties of ours all get broken into by the same group. They started stealing TVs, they started squatting in the places, and what was really crazy is a lot of these kids were high schoolers. They would skip out of school, and during the day they would come break in. And then another group would come break in at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the morning. And multiple of these students left their student IDs, and we even called the school to try to stop them. The thing about Philadelphia is they are so overworked, the police force doesn't really have time to care about things like theft or truancy. They only decided to finally call us back after the same group was caught on camera stomping a 75-year-old man to death. They eventually caught those kids. It took a few weeks, but our properties were crucial in them nailing down where these kids were going to be because they kept breaking into our properties over the course of months. And sadly, later I heard that they shot and killed a 13-year-old girl for telling on them for the bad stuff that they were doing. Eventually, after 6 months plus of break-ins and buying, I cannot tell you how many replacement TVs and how many reservations we had to cancel and how many thousands of dollars that we spent on night security to try to get the whole thing in order, we just decided to let it go and move on, and we are no longer in Philadelphia. But even if it's not some diabolical thing like gang activity or party kids in Miami or Tulum, there are still going to be deaths. It's going to happen. We had a longer-term Airbnb stay in Fort Worth near a medical facility in Fort Worth, and the gentleman had a lot of issues, and he was there for medical reasons. And at one point he died, and he failed to make a payment for an extension that we had him due for. We didn't hear from him for 4, 5, 6, 7 days. When the building went to go access the unit for a routine maintenance thing, they saw that he had passed maybe 3 or 4 days prior, and his dog was standing there protecting his body when the maintenance guy came in. Something like this is actually so normal to Airbnb that we didn't have any issues. They didn't block the listing. They didn't need to investigate anything. We just, of course, dealt with the family. The police came in and brought specialized people to handle the body issue. And then we kind of ended up moving on eventually. Actually, surprisingly faster than you may think. In Houston, we had a group that booked a property and then stole all of the furniture out of a 2-bedroom property. This was years ago. We're talking the birth of when I was doing Airbnb, 2016, 17, 18 is when this happened. Airbnb did write us a pretty good check for all the furniture we had to replace, and we were able to keep on moving. Airbnb support did do a good job there. Things that happened that Airbnb never did anything about. There was a guy who stole my identity. When I first started hosting in Houston in 2015, there's a man who rented apartments in the same building that I was doing Airbnb, where I had permission with the building. He used my photo, my name, and everything, and then he tried to stage his units to look almost identical to mine. So that way, when people are online looking at Airbnb properties, it just looked like his listings were duplicates of my listings. We did not find out about this until a couple months in, when there was an Asian couple that was having a hard time trying to check into the listing, and they called me saying, hey, your Airbnb guest can't get into the room. And we didn't have any information for this person because all of our units had already been booked and we didn't have any check-ins that day. This kid was a Rice University student. I still have his information in my phone. I sent him a cease and desist, and when I called him to tell him that what he was doing was fraud, he had the audacity to ask me how I ran my business and how I was getting permission from buildings. The guy had no remorse for what he's doing. And I just heard that in West Hollywood, people have listings for less than 30 days that are actually representative of listings in other neighborhoods where you cannot list on Airbnb for less than 30 days. Because of that restriction, people are making their listings in a proxy location and then having you stay in a property that might even be somewhere like Calabasas or Agora Hills or Laguna Beach or God knows where, but the listing address is still pinned in West Hollywood. See, the point is there's a lot of wet cats to herd here. It's a deregulated market where anybody can get in, and there's really not a lot stopping somebody who's a sub-quality service provider from trying to provide a service. Airbnb wants a lot of people to try to host, but we are dealing with people's livelihoods. We are dealing with trust, where people need to make sure that they can show up to a place. There's going to be a key in a front door and the key's going to work or the code's going to work, and they're not going to have an issue with police or gangs or the property being 40 minutes from where they thought it was going to be or any other fiasco. And in Houston, this has happened to both me and some of my friends who host in Houston, where people have fired bullets through the walls of our houses or our apartments, scaring the crap out of our Airbnb guests, of course, leading to refunds and then deactivating listings for safety. See, Airbnb will try to gain control of the problem by shutting your listing down, by maybe even shutting your account down. Because at the end of the day, if they cannot control the problem, they can try to scapegoat a host and just say we removed them from the platform, we did everything that we could. Where the truth is, there are millions of listings, and when we look at the law of large numbers, there are going to be deaths, there are going to be crimes, there are going to be physical altercations, there are going to be extremely deranged guests. There's going to be all sorts of things that will happen, and they can be at random. They can happen to any hosts or any guests. Now, there are levels of risk here, and that's why Airbnb has built their algorithm to remove certain people from the platform and to try to stop certain booking behavior. And Airbnb looks at reviews and looks at host behaviors to try to determine if a host is good for the platform or if they are a risk and they should drop hosts. Airbnb drops hosts all the time for a risk. I think two things can be done to help solve the initial problem, the innocent death of a child. One, hosts should be able to cancel anyone for what they feel to be cause, any number of times, infinite cancellations if they believe that this reservation is going to be a risk. Airbnb doesn't want to allow this because they have a non-discrimination policy. Where Airbnb can step in would be where it looks like it's clear discrimination, or there looks like there is evidence of discrimination, then Airbnb can step in. But I think Airbnb needs to take this innocent until proven guilty approach with the hosts and let hosts better shepherd their listings and cancel guests that they don't think are a good fit for their listing or that are a risk. And then if Airbnb wants to do a good job, they can take that guest and try to find them a new place to stay. And they may realize in their endeavors to try to find this one person new places to stay that hosts don't want that one guest because that guest is actually a risk. And then Airbnb could drop that person from the platform and we'd all be okay. And then on the other side of the coin, Airbnb needs to force disclosure of at-risk activities that have happened in properties. If there was a gunshot in a property, if there was a party in a property, if there was a theft in a property, Airbnb needs to disclose to future potential guests that this has happened within a set period of time. They need to allow people to cancel or relocate if they're not comfortable for those reasons. And in this case, maybe Airbnb's insurance could pick up the tab because Airbnb's air cover does pay for loss of income now with air cover. So if somebody throws a wild party and then the next couple of guests cancel out of fear for something like this, the host might still be able to get some form of payment and they can take the time to work out making sure that the home is truly ready for the next guest. I don't think there's a clean solution anywhere, but there are steps forward here. And us as hosts, we need to stay ever vigilant to the fact that our guests matter, their lives matter, their experience matters. I would love to hear your opinions. And if you have any stories to share, crazy stuff that's happened to you, please put them in the comments. Let's make it a conversation. And as always, guys, I'll see you on the other side.